What's up, y'all? Welcome to another episode of the Prisons Upon Us podcast, where we explore the journeys of those impacted by incarceration and the pathways to transformation. I'm your host, Dr. Craig Wali, and today we have a special guest, the brother Lucas Verbsky, a Veterans Justice Program Reentry Specialist. Lucas has dedicated his career to helping incarcerated veterans navigate the challenges of reentry, from securing stable housing to accessing mental health care. In our conversation, we'll discuss the unique struggles veterans face compared to the general population, the support systems available, and what more can be done to ensure successful reintegration. Whether you're a veteran, an advocate, or just eager to learn more, this episode is packed with valuable insights. So stay with us. Let's go. Yo, what it do?
Hey, grateful to be here with you and appreciate your efforts to uplift our community.
Yo, and I am so grateful for you being here too, good brother. I'm always humbled by people such as yourself who are willing to share their experience and their time, man, really, because this is something serious. We're fighting for lives. You know what I'm saying? So
Indeed, we are.
if we can, man, let's just jump right into it. Maybe you can just start by introducing yourself.
Peace. My name is Lucas Rubsky. I work with the Veterans Justice Program, focusing on reentry at the Durham VA. So my views may not be those of the VA. I don't represent them, but I'm appreciative to have this conversation.
Yeah, man.
I am a licensed clinical social worker. I want to be real upfront that I did not serve in the armed forces and I have not spent time on an adult spread, so I do not consider myself an expert. But I've had the good fortune of working with brothers and sisters who did wear the uniform and who are incarcerated in state and federal prisons across North Carolina for approximately the last 13 years.
Wow, man. So I guess, man, just with that right there, what inspired your work to focus on veterans who are impacted by the carceral system?
So I would say that, as a youth, a lot of my mentors had spent significant amounts of time behind the walls, and I come to North Carolina with a GED and a opportunity to go to college in '98 that my family provided for me. And I've volunteered in institutions since about 1999, right? And I was real fortunate as a part of my training to do an apprenticeship with the VA and start working with the VA for several years before this position became available. And so when it opened up, it just seemed like a real good fit because my heart has always been, for folks in the struggle, so to speak. I feel like largely because of my melanin deficiency and family's access to resources, I didn't have to go into institutions like that. You know what I mean? And so I just feel like in some small way, I'm able to serve those who have served.
Right on. And that's powerful, man. I really appreciate that because there's not a lot of people who are willing to, I guess, step on this side of the fence, I guess, for lack of a better term, particularly people who have melanin deficiency. They want to use their privilege for their own privilege, but you're using your privilege to uplift people who have been marginalized and out of reach of privilege, should I say. So I really appreciate that. And I'm sure the people you work with appreciate that as well.
That's the
Um,
hope, brother. We all here on this rock together, and we're supposed to strive to help each other.
this is true, man. A great example of that in the wild kingdom are the ants. They are so small, but they help each other in everything that they do, and they overcome what seems to be insurmountable obstacles. And so I think if we could help each other, we'd be that much more successful as a species.
Agreed.
So tell me, man, what experiences shaped your understanding of the intersection between incarceration and health disparities, particularly those of veterans?
So, as you well know, brother, folks who are incarcerated are much higher risk factors for all kinds of chronic health conditions, some of which, we haven't even seen so much on this side of the wall for quite some time. I think one of the advantages that veterans have, provided that they're eligible for VA healthcare, is they have that link, right? But I want to be real clear that just because the individual took the oath and wore the uniform, there's still some, eligibility criteria, length of time and service, character of discharge, and I think one of the strongest examples I could give was there was a gentleman I've met with several times during his period of incarceration who lived with chronic health conditions, needed daily medications. And I kept encouraging him to apply for healthcare. And he kept saying,
Mhm.
"Hey, man, I only serve for this period of time. Nothing's happening." And so he wasn't willing to put in that paperwork. And I happened to bump into him on the street after he was released, and he was living at an emergency shelter. We didn't have Medicaid expansion at that time, so he was at risk of running out of his antiviral medications that he had to take every day. And so I was like, "Hey, let's go up to the VA." And we went up there, and, could be a chance wasn't anything happening. But we went
Right.
in, and because he served before 81 and had an honorable discharge, he didn't have to have, 24 months. And so he went from staying in the emergency shelter to unsure of being able to access life-saving medical care, to having all of his medical benefits taken care of, to finding out that because he was Vietnam era, he was eligible for a non-service connected pension, which means he was going to start getting income, every month, and he then became eligible for some housing things. So I really think that education and knowledge is so important, and for
Mhm.
folks to just to put in to find out, could I potentially be eligible for some of these benefits?
Yeah, and that's dope too. What you said about education and knowledge and just finding out. I was talking to a brother a couple weeks ago, and he said that's the biggest thing, just the willingness to go find out. Because when we go find out, we come into all types of knowledge, and many times it's much more than what we knew. And it also makes me think of that old adage, the closed mouth don't get fed. And so this gentleman that you talked about, if it wasn't for you, I guess basically he wouldn't have opened his mouth and he wouldn't have got fed, and he just would have suffered. So beautiful thing there. What do you think are some of the most pressing health issues affecting incarcerated individuals?
So, I'll say, if we know that well over, conservative figures over 85%. I've seen other figures that say, over 95% of folks who are incarcerated have some kind of history of substance use, right?
Hmm.
Even though, the sentence might not be specific to that, so they have a history. So we know that that's one that's real serious. And then we know that there are higher rates of mental illness. I mean, one of the things I've really appreciated for you is talking about the impact of trauma, right?
Yeah, man.
From youth, from being in the system and being in oppressive environments. Some people
Hmm.
would say that that's not mental illness, but like trauma is real serious. And then we just
Yeah.
know a host of other health conditions, hypertension, diabetes,
Hmm.
hepatitis, so all kinds of things. For veterans, I want to make sure that I'm highlighting, the severity of post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury, right? Which
Hmm.
folks would say are the hallmarks of the continuous since 2001, right?
Yeah,
And sometimes those are, invisible wounds, right? It's easy to see if
absolutely.
someone is missing an arm or in a wheelchair, and
Hmm.
those are absolutely real wounds. But so
Absolutely.
are these invisible wounds. These are
Hmm.
real, but we just might not see them with our eyes as clear.
Right. And it's interesting, when we talk about those invisible wounds as human beings, we don't validate something unless we can sense it, unless we can see it, feel it, smell it, touch it. So it's important for us to really pay attention to these invisible wounds, and particularly what you talked about, that trauma and that post-traumatic stress disorder, and I think trauma brings on a host of other ailments that many of us are not even aware of, or many of us have, particularly those of us coming out of prison. And I'll share a bit of my own personal story, which is I have had some major organ issues. And I think it's all related to the trauma. And as I've done my own research, a lot of research points to that trauma, 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 be it early childhood trauma, be it just the trauma of living in prison, which is a very stressful environment. Um, so that just, it blows me away that you're talking about that, and we're right on the same points with that. So thank you for
Well,
sharing that.
I, I think you're bringing up a real important point. When we look at these adverse childhood experiences, right, or trauma and stress in general,
Mhm,
and how
mhm.
having cortisol released for long periods of time, like degrades the
Mm.
immune deficiencies, and so
Yeah, yeah.
absolutely opens it up for a host of other things going on. But if we
Mhm.
can't address some of those underlying things, and
Yeah, man.
my thoughts are sometimes some of those are like larger societal issues. Certainly you
Mhm,
can help me with what I'm living for, but if we're not changing the
mhm.
systemic arrangements that help
Yeah.
create the condition for the people,
Mhm.
I think we're somewhat missing the boat.
I agree with you, man. I agree with you. And so that leads me to thinking about some of the people who are doing work that you're doing, which is working in the community with people coming out of prison as well as people preparing to come out of prison. Um, what is the role you think does access to healthcare, um, both inside and outside of prison, play in a successful reentry?
So if we're talking about, the whole person, right? We're
Hmm.
talking about looking holistically. So obviously it's really important, hey, do we have housing set up? Do I have employment? Do I have educational opportunities? Do I have income? Do I have access to healthcare? Because all of these pieces go together. And if any one of them is missing, there's going to be more difficulties and barriers. So
Right.
absolutely trying to make sure that folks have access to quality health care.
Yeah, that's important. Quality healthcare. One of the things we hear about in prisons and jails is that people have access to healthcare, but it isn't quality healthcare. And I think that that's important to point out. And when we look at folks who are emerging, they typically are coming back to the communities seemingly in better shape, but they typically take very quick dives to become in a position where they're worse off than when they went in. And I think a lot has to do with the poor health care behind the wall, as well as that gap between the penitentiary and back to the community.
And I think, one of the other things is trying to make sure that we're talking with providers about addressing their own stigmas, right? And so
Yeah, yeah.
somebody hears, so and so just came home after doing X amount, or
Hmm.
here's what the charge was, and
Hmm.
sometimes that can create a barrier. So even though there's access
Hmm.
to that healthcare, if
Hmm.
I'm being treated differently, and so
Yeah,
some of what we try to do is uh, educate providers as well, that at the end of the day, we're talking about human beings, and in this situation, we're talking about veterans as well, right? And
hmm.
so these are, not entitlement benefits. These are benefits that folks signed a blank check with their lives, right?
Yeah,
And
man. Yeah.
it's a societal contract that
Hmm.
should be honored from both sides.
Absolutely, man. And I think many people that doctors see um, probably have experienced some levels of trauma that have contributed to some of the health challenges that they have. And then I think that many doctors, it's not even on their radar to think about the impact that incarceration has on people. recently I was at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem talking with the Physicians for Human Rights about the impact of incarceration on health. And many of those students, it was a student group, and many of them were just totally unaware. They said, we never thought about it. And a couple of them mentioned, we're in a privileged position. And as we know, many people who go to prison are coming from disadvantaged positions where there is very little privilege. So there's, again, a gap, a gulf there, so people miss the boat in some regards. So thinking about community, man, um, what role do you think health workers, social workers, peer recovery specialists, and the like play in supporting successful reentry?
So, I think about like the example of the FIT program across
Mm,
North Carolina and the model that comes from. Uh,
mm,
and I think about, just in my own personal life, when I've experienced adversity or trying situations, how beneficial it was to have someone who had walked that path to help guide me. So I think, we have a great example of peer mentors, working with
mhm,
folks, man, making that happen. But I think also whether an individual has, been incarcerated or not, just trying to be mindful and trying to keep those lines of communication open and keep the encouragement, right? Coming out can be a real stressful situation. Now I'm
mhm.
presented with all of these options and these different things coming at me at the same time. And while, going to the doctor is something important, like how do I navigate the bus system? How
Yeah.
do I there's all kinds of other pieces, and so I think
Mhm,
it's not just as simple as telling someone, "Hey, call this number. Here's the address. Go there."
mhm.
Being able to keep the communication open and trying to brainstorm what barriers are there. I really wish that I had the capacity to like walk with each person physically.
Right.
Unfortunately, I don't have that capacity. So at the very least, trying to keep the communication open and link them with other people in the community as well.
Yeah, and that's important having that community, that common unity, that support system, people who are basically down for you, down with you to help you, as you said, navigate. And it takes me back to something you said earlier about, there's a variety of pieces. And if one of those pieces is missing, then we're off balance basically. And in my mind, I'm imagining like a 100,000 pieces puzzle, or with all these different pieces, and it's like, man, how do I put all these pieces together? And I think what happens with many people is if they don't have the support to put all these pieces together, they just say, "F it," let me go back to doing what I do, or let me just let that go, and then they suffer in the long run. And probably other people connected to them in the community and family suffer because they don't have the resources or the supports.
I'd seen recently a piece, I think it was the capital area workforce development out of Raleigh, and they had some interviews with Mecca and Scotso, who are
Hmm.
real involved in Durham and Orange. And I was really impressed at just how clear they were talking about, just going into the Social Security office or just going into, try to get a license, all of these different things. And what a benefit is if there's a community to support that person,
Hmm.
formal or informal.
That's right.
I think that, sometimes, while certainly, that there should be funding in the community for things, we also got to tap in, whether it's the faith community, whether it's, you know, 12-step recovery communities. We got to tap into, because the reality is what, brother? One out of four people in North Carolina have some form of criminal history.
Hmm.
And so, by those numbers, that means a whole lot of people on the outside have navigated how to
Yeah,
do that.
yeah, yeah. So there's people there that can help other people do it. Absolutely, man. So what do you think can be done, man, to to ensure that formerly incarcerated people are getting continued medical and mental health care after they get out of prison, post release?
So I think one of the first things is to make sure that our efforts are led by folks who have that experience, right? So if you got a joker like me,
Hmm.
who maybe spent some time in a juvenile detention center and did this or that, now I got a suit and tie on and I have a degree. I'm somewhat removed from that
Yeah.
direct experience, right? And so
Hmm.
although I might have what I consider to be terrific ideas, they might not be grounded in reality, right?
Mm.
So making sure that the efforts from Jump Street are led by people with lived experience, I think is like that's number one. Number two is the education and information and motivation that we talked about earlier, right? And that's not just educating people coming out. That's also educating, the community in these different systems of like,
Yeah.
how do we adequately respond and address?
Hmm. Yeah, so educating the service providers and also bringing folks, as you said, with lived experience to the forefront. And one of the things I always tell people is that the smartest and most capable people I've ever met in my life have been those men I met behind the wall on the cell block and spinning the yard. And many times, I think only thing that's missing is opportunity, opportunity to be legitimate, opportunity to lead something that's not going to get them put in the penitentiary. Because the group, the demographics have so much potential and possibilities, capabilities. It's just about getting that opportunity. So leading from that perspective, I would agree with you, is so important, man.
And I
But
think
go
I,
ahead.
we'd be remiss if we didn't also just, briefly mention some of the history of the prison system in this country,
Mm.
right? And so we know
Mhm.
that, the 13th Amendment clearly states that slavery and indentured servitude has been abolished except for the convicted felon, right? And if we
That's right.
look
That's
at,
right.
what happened after the failed promise of Reconstruction, and we look
Hmm.
at the convict lease system, if we look at
Yes,
some of the
sir.
black codes, a
Hmm.
lot of folks, get down on the South like the South is the only one. But if we, actually look at our whole country's history, this is a uniquely American
Yeah.
experience. Whether it's south of the Mason-Dixon line, which most people forget was, what, almost up to New Jersey, right?
Yes, sir.
And so I think just, trying to come to grips with some of the things that have led to this, right? And particularly in a time now where it can seem so divisive to talk about history, right? We're
Yeah.
not talking about it to make folks uncomfortable. We're talking about any time that there's a problem one issue, we have to look at what are some of the root causes of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And what happened maybe to navigate through whatever challenges were facing people at any particular time so that we can learn from the past to help inform the future. Yeah.
I
I
mean,
really
and if we
dig that.
look at what the the war on drugs, right? We ain't got to go all the way back to Harry Anslinger, or
Hmm.
when they was going against the opium dens and then
Hmm.
saying this and that. We could just look at from the 70s, which is really where we seen the proliferation
Hmm.
of the prison industrial complex, right? And,
Yes, sir.
some folks would make the argument that a lot of that was political in nature, right? Like,
Hmm.
how do we go after folks that are striving to make changes in the community? Now, I don't mean to sound naive that, sometimes some of us may do some things that
Right.
but again, if we look at what are all of the components that made this, right? It's not certainly I believe in accountability and personal, responsibility and such.
Hmm.
But again, what are all of the components that go into
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. We got to look at everything. We can't ignore important pieces, or else we don't come up with the right solution when we start ignoring things. And so the problems will persist, as I'm sure you know. So what do you think some key lessons are that policymakers, healthcare providers, decision makers, and I guess communities in large need to understand about incarceration and health.
So I don't want to say sound cliche, brother, but I think going back to what you just said about the beautiful intelligence, the the stark resilience of some of the brothers and sisters, right? Like, and grounding it in humanity. That ultimately what we're talking about are human rights, right?
Yeah,
And so I think that there are some examples that we can look at of what have been some great attempts. Too soon in North Carolina to really show how that Medicaid expansion, certainly a step, right?
yeah.
I think looking at that model that Fit came out of, the one,
Hmm.
what is it, out of California and such.
Yeah,
They've
yeah.
been doing that for some years, and Fit's
Hmm.
been going for some time here as well. But
Yeah.
ultimately, I think it goes back to grounding it in folks with lived experience. And if we've got to look at just a cost benefit analysis, right? Allowing folks to have preventative care or chronic care, you know, healthcare for chronic conditions
Yeah,
by the dollars is always going to be less expensive than waiting until there's an exasperation uh,
yeah.
for that. This is unrelated, but it reminds me of some of the arguments that led to syringe decriminalization in North Carolina, right? And it's slightly related because we know that folks who are coming out of incarceration are extremely higher likelihood to die of a fatal overdose,
Hmm.
even a year out, right? But
Right.
one of the arguments was, hey, if folks can have access to clean syringes without, getting charged for possession of paraphernalia, like, a clean syringe costs less than $1. Long-term health care for hepatitis C,
Hmm.
HIV,
Yep.
getting endocarditis and having to have valve transplants. So even if we might struggle over the humanity aspect or the personal decision aspect,
Yeah.
like let's just look at it from straight up what are we investing, what are we
Hmm.
investing in, because
Yeah.
either
Public
way,
health.
easy, sir, that's a strong word you just said.
But yeah, it's public health, public safety, man.
We're talking about the health of the community too, right?
Right,
Because
right,
when
right.
our loved ones are returning to, our families and our neighborhoods, their health impacts all of our health, right? Just like my
Exactly.
health impacts others. So again, looking at how we're all interrelated, and I can't, help but try to frame it in like humanity.
Yeah, yeah.
So excuse
And
me if I danced around your question. I
you
don't
did
forget
not,
what you
brother.
asked.
I think you did not dance around it. I think you hit it head on. And the beautiful part about it is that you dropped that suggestion or that suggestion that we grounded in humanity. And as you know, our society tends to strip us of our humanity once we go to prison. And it's hard to be seen as a human once again. You know, you're considered a felon or uh, an inmate or all these other things other than the potential that you have or who you are, just a human being, a father, a uncle, or a carpenter, all these other things. We just get superimposed with these negative deficit based um, identities that society gives us. And so I think it strips us of our humanity and strips us of the potential or greater potential for other people to come closer to us. We become more like the boogeyman, and nobody wants to get close to the boogeyman, you know. So I
And when
think you
you
hit it
say
right
that,
on.
it reminds me of, the power of language. And although I
Hmm.
may not always use the, correct terminology, when I when I first started in this role, it was called I think the language was Incarcerated Veterans Program, right? There was a guidebook that, had come before me. And I remember going into an institution and meeting with a gentleman, Vietnam era veteran who's been, incarcerated since the 80s, eligible for parole, and him pulling me to the side and saying, hey, brother, shouldn't it be veterans incarcerated? Like, shouldn't we put, the human point first, right? And,
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
really appreciated him pulling my coattail to that because I hadn't
Yeah.
thought about,
Hmm.
what the implication of the language was and how that
Yeah.
how that sounds to people.
Yeah. That's heavy. And language definitely shapes our perspective and our perception without us even realizing it. And so it's important to pay attention to language. And so we're coming up on the end of our time together, but I got just a couple last questions for you.
Sure.
Um, and one of them is what advice you would you give to uh, justice impacted people who want to take charge of their own health and well-being?
So for those who have worn the uniform, have taken the oath, the big first thing I can say is even if you don't think that you are eligible, put in some paperwork. Let's find out, are you eligible for VA healthcare? Take the time to sit down with a veteran service officer in your community. Almost every county in North Carolina has a county veteran service officer. If those options, after you've explored them, if they're not available to you, let's look at what other community options are there. But let's try to explore everything. And just because a door seems closed, let's make sure every angle of the door that it actually is closed.
Right.
Perhaps it's just almost shut. Maybe it's not locked. And so, taking the steps to really find out what's available and not just listening to the first, oh, well, so and so said ain't nothing there. And
And
then
that
the
word
other
of
thing I
mouth.
would say is remember that there is a community, whether you connected with them or not. There are people that believe in you and absolutely want to see you reintegrate because we know the gifts that you have to this community. And so taking the time to find those people who can help to help build what you already have. Maybe it's not build, maybe it's, wiping away some of those barriers and
Mhm.
stigmas so that you can
Yeah.
reclaim your part in the community.
Wow, man, that's beautiful, Lucas. I'm getting chills just thinking about or just letting what you just said resonate with me. It's beautiful. I'm getting chills, man. So that's definitely powerful. And thinking about your journey in this work, where you've come from when you entered this field to where you are now, if you could capture that journey or that experience in a catchphrase or a title, or what would you call it or what would you name it? What would that be?
Keep striving, stay open, uh, stay grounded, and be willing to learn from
Yeah,
others, right?
yeah.
Never thinking that that I have attained some level of knowing something. Like,
Mhm.
just keep striving, regardless of the barriers, regardless of the wins. We
Yeah,
have to keep pushing for our communities.
absolutely, man. Absolutely. So, how can people support your work, man, or get involved in advocating for better health outcomes for justice impacted communities and specifically veterans?
So, a couple ways. I'm glad you asked that. So one is I think that the local reentry councils across the state, if you live somewhere where there are, just getting familiar with what's available there, right? And then being familiar for veterans, like who's the point person. So we have folks at the Asheville VA, Fayetteville VA, Salisbury VA, Durham VA, that are designated point persons. So just knowing, who they are. And if you don't
Mhm.
know who they are, knowing where is the VA and knowing that there is somebody there.
Right on.
And then the other real thing is remembering, where the veteran service officers who can help explore the whole array of benefits that are there. So I really think it starts with relationship building, and that, being willing to share stories,
Mhm.
with people that sit in positions of power.
Yeah. Powerful, man. Relationship building. We can't get nothing done without proper relationships with others. And I think the best way to build those relationships is through connecting. And the best way to connect is through our stories. It's the shortest distance between two people are those stories. So you've said a whole lot of powerful stuff, brother, and I really appreciate your time. Is there anything that I didn't ask you or anything that was left unsaid that you want to drop in the last couple minutes we have together?
Just that, if I said anything that was correct, I want to give credit to, those that have come before me, and anything that
Yeah.
I said that I was out of line, that's on me. But just remembering that at the end of the day, we're all human beings, and that we've got to find a way to bridge to make it better for all of us. If they not free, we not free, right?
That's true. That's true. That's so right. That's so right. Yo, man, I appreciate your time, man. This has been for me, this has been spiritual. This has been a great conversation. Um, you are sage-like, and I can feel your energy. It's very powerful, man. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for your insights.
Hey, thank you for continuing to breathe life and share the stories of our community. I wish you peace and blessings, brother.
Peace and blessings, beloved. Peace. But in the meantime, brother, I wish you peace, wish you blessings, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Hey, the same, and serious business, man. I appreciate you continuing to amplify the voices of our brothers and sisters, and much love.
Right on. Peace.
Peace, brother.
Yo, if you or someone you know is interested in being a guest on the Prison to Promise podcast, please hit me up at Dr. Craig Waleed at gmail.com. I'll spell it for you. That's DrCraigWaleed. That's two E's as in Edward and one D as in David. Dr. Craig Waleed at gmail.com. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you next time. Peace.